So, if you didn't know, the federal eviction moratorium expires today. I literally checked about 20 minutes before I started shooting just to make sure that there was not a deal in Congress to save that, but there wasn't. So let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about the eviction moratorium, what it was, what it meant, what was wrong with it, and then we're going to move forward and talk a little bit about what it means now that it's gone away. Okay? So first, the eviction moratorium is what was put in place by the Centers for Disease Control, and this effectively was under their authority. So the CDC has this authority to kind of institute these eviction moratoria if there's a national health emergency, right? Effectively, we can say, hey, there's an issue like, I don't know, a global pandemic that it would make forcing people out of their homes particularly dangerous. Now, I would argue forcing people out of their homes for any reason at any time is particularly dangerous, but, it's an argument for another day. So they, put this into effect, which effectively meant that with very rare exception, you could not be evicted from your home, or if you're a renter, and if you are a homeowner, you couldn't be foreclosed out of your home during this time, right? So this was great in theory, right? So it stopped all these people who had just been laid off from being kicked out for non-payment of rent and other stuff like that. So that was put in place September 4th, 2020. And so it's coming up on a year, or it would have been coming up on a year just next month. Sorry, not next month, August, but next month, September. And I mean, for the most part, it was pretty good, right? So people could, they had somewhere to stay, that they could quarantine, right? A lot of us were told to work from home if we could, to stay away from other people to prevent either spreading the disease that we've contracted or to, or catching the disease, from other people. So it was very important as part of the federal government's plan to get this moving in this way, okay? And by the way, this isn't a partisan thing, right? The Trump administration put this in place. The Biden administration was extending it. Now, originally, I believe it was supposed to go to the end of June, but it had been extended. Now, what had happened was the plan was to extend it an additional time, I think to the end of August or to the end of the year. I don't really remember what the actual plan was supposed to be, but there was a plan to extend it. But the Supreme Court, there was a case that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court pretty much said the CDC doesn't have the authority to do that. So President Biden essentially said to Congress, hey guys, I need you to pass a law saying that, I can pass eviction moratoriums or eviction moratoria or whatever, but I can extend it. Well, they didn't. So now, there were some problems with the eviction moratoria. The largest one was that all it really stopped people from doing was physically kicking people out of their homes. Landlords and banks could still file foreclosure and eviction proceedings. They could actually do all the paperwork ahead of time, but those cases couldn't be processed in courts. Now, I have a friend of mine who works in the court system who tells me that there are lots of evictions just waiting to go through. And now, because it's expired, on Monday, these claims are going to start to process, right? Unless individual states do things in order to make sure that this can't go forward any longer, because we are, in fact, still in a global pandemic. But the main issue here, as you can see, was that this wasn't actually stopping people from filing evictions, from filing foreclosure actions in courts, but it just said, hey, the court can't act on it. So essentially, we are very much in the running for an incredible wave of houselessness and homelessness going on fairly soon, because people have not been paying rent. Rent was not frozen. Rent was still due to the extent that you could pay it. And there was no real mechanism to help people out. Now, there is federal money out there that people should be able to use to help themselves. But according to recent reporting out of the federal government, this process has moved incredibly slowly. Landlords have not gotten this money. banks have not gotten this money, tenants and owners haven't gotten this money. So there's lots of slowdown. The requests are being processed at a very slow rate. There was recently a congressional hearing about it that talked a little bit about why things are going so slow, and the reaction of the department was, yeah, it's slow, but we're moving faster than we were. So it's like, it's a faster snail, not just any old snail. It's a racing snail, I guess. But so this was, this created all sorts of problems. One, landlords still had to pay their property taxes. They still had to pay their mortgages for their buildings, right, to banks. Individuals still had to pay their mortgages. So, we had the ability to freeze all those payments to make it so that back rent wasn't due, and just to alleviate all this. But we didn't. We just said you can't actually kick people out. So people are still suffering. And not that I'm on the side of banks and landlords per se, but they do owe money to someone else, right? A lot of what rent goes to, other than their pockets directly, is they're paying someone else, and the banks are paying back the federal government who lent them the money, and there's a whole cycle of someone paying someone else. Okay, which is why the original moratorium was not particularly powerful. All it did was it kept you physically in the space, but it didn't stop you from being kicked out like Monday, which is going to happen to lots of people unless Congress can get their shit together and do something very soon. Now, apparently, according to Politico, they did try to put a bill forth in Congress yesterday, but it was not. But they weren't able to get the votes. So this is all obviously very frustrating, and I'm about to give you some of the information about why this is so frustrating, other than the fact that lots of people will lose their homes. But in my mind, Biden actually had an out here. He could have just said, by executive order, you can't evict anyone anymore. Now, was it legal for him to do that? Well, it doesn't seem like it was, and it's entirely possible that it wasn't. But if he does that, it's a show of strength. It's him saying, from a policy perspective, this is what I want to see, and it puts the onus on the courts to then be the bad guy and strike it down. Whereas Biden just kind of sat back and let the thing expire and said, oh, well, this has to be in Congress. No, dude, you have power. You have the ability to challenge the courts, to kind of go to the other side, to say, look, I'm going to do it whether you like it or not. Trump did this all the time. Now, was his stuff struck down? Yeah, it was, but it took a while to get through the courts. It took time for the courts to do this. And by the way, if Biden had taken the same strategy, that is valuable time that people who cannot pay their back rent and cannot pay their back foreclosure bills or whatever, mortgage bills, have to figure something out. That's more time that people have to get jobs if they're looking for them, right? There's all these things that more time would give people. But right now, that just isn't an option that was considered. It wasn't like, oh, well, I'm gonna swing for the fences and, let the court be the bad guys who throw out lots of people, right? Because that could be a great pitch for Democrats to retain the White House, right? Hey, if you put us back in the White House, we will put in judges and justices that are not going to, that are going to make sure that these bills and executive orders that I put through are going to, uphold these very basic things like not kicking people out of their homes during a pandemic. So it just frustrates me a lot to see Biden kind of capitulate right away and said, oh, like there's nothing I can do to throw up his hands. There is something you can do, man. You can challenge the way that things are. The way that precedent gets set in courts, for those of you who don't know, is through case law, right? So someone challenges something because they don't like it, right? Biden could have challenged the courts by saying, yeah, I know you said the CDC can't do it. Okay, fine. So I, as the president of the United States, am just going to say no evictions for, I don't know, ever. It doesn't have to be ever, but you can say till the end of the pandemic, right? You can say, until case counts in the United States reach a certain level or vaccines get to a certain level or whatever. You could have given some metric, you could have made it very narrowly tailored, and you could have forced the courts to kind of like wriggle around with the idea of, well, can he do this? Can he not do this? And by the way, all that takes time, right? A Supreme Court case, unless it's done in an emergency way, which something like this probably wouldn't be, could take months. You could give people 4 or 5 months to try and figure out their financial situation, work with their landlords, work with their banks to figure something out. But that's not what happened, okay? So I'm very frustrated about that. I'm very frustrated that this didn't get a ton of coverage. until very recently. Literally, I didn't see anyone reporting about this until a couple of days ago, where there was a sudden realization, oh shit, tens of millions of people might get kicked out of their homes because these evictions can now be acted on. And it's not can be filed, because as I said earlier, they have been filed. There are stacks of evictions and foreclosures just waiting to go through the court systems. Now, luckily for the people who are, on the defending side of these, the courts are still going very slowly. There's still, pandemic restrictions in a lot of the courts, and things are moving fairly slowly. And the courts have an incredible backlog from other things too that weren't able to be processed through the pandemic. But this is just one more reason why Biden could have challenged it and said, I'm going to put something else in the courts. I'm going to put another stumbling block in there to stop people from getting evicted. So again, just very disappointed with the Biden administration on this, and very disappointed with congressional Democrats for not pulling this through. I mean, by the way, this is one more reason we need to get rid of the filibuster, but again, it's a conversation for another day. So what happens now, right? So a lot of these cases are in court right now, as I mentioned, and they're going to go through the eviction process. So if you are a tenant, most cities do not guarantee you some form of legal defense for your eviction. So oftentimes people who can barely make rent are being asked to hire attorneys. Now, sometimes there are great organizations out there like Community Legal Services, or your city's equivalent, that essentially does lawyering for people who can't afford lawyers, which is a super important thing, and they do really great work. But a lot of the times there aren't a ton of these attorneys around, and there aren't a ton of attorneys who can do pro bono work like this on such a grand scale. And by the way, it's strained even in the best of times, but now that we have literally tens of millions of evictions and foreclosures pending, it's going to be really difficult for people to do that. Now, some cities, I believe New York and Philadelphia, have they require that the court assigns you like a public defender type person. I don't actually think they're called public defenders, but they have some name. You're assigned a lawyer to help you defend your case, which is great. It does certainly help, but all this could be avoided if we just took the step at first of just making sure that people weren't put in this situation in the first place, right? Giving lawyers to people is a Band-Aid where we could have just stopped us from getting the wound in the first place, right? It's not a great metaphor, but you get the general idea, right? It's not preventative. It's completely reactive in the way that it diagnoses, in the way that it fixes this problem. So anyway, so these are going to go through, and then what's going to happen is a lot of these people are going to lose, either because they don't have lawyers, or because they actually can't pay rent, or for some other reason, right? There are lots of reasons that they can lose it. You may have had a job requirement or an income threshold requirement for you to be in your apartment. If you can no longer keep that up, they might have legal cause to throw you out on a contract claim, right? There are lots of kind of nuances in the law where landlords can chuck you out of your home, which is very unfortunate, and I wish we weren't there. But for those people who are going to be okay, myself included, thank heavens, we now need to be prepared to help out in any way we can, whether it's GoFundMes or other types of kind of reactive and mutual aid that we can do. The other thing we need to be aware of is now that all these people may not have homes, we are going to be in a situation where COVID can transmit wildly between all these people. Now, it's not entirely possible. It's entirely possible that, there's enough spread out, in the country that not all these people are in similar places can get COVID, but it's very hard to isolate when you don't have a place that you can call home to go to and to, quarantine in, right? And it costs cities lots of money for there to be more unhoused and homeless populations. So, we are going to suffer for this as a community, not least to say, obviously not as much to the people who are actually being thrown out of their places to live, but, there are lots of consequences here that I don't think were considered before we kind of went down this path. So I know this segment has been a little long, and I'm explaining little things at a time here. But the thing to take away from this segment is the eviction moratorium as it wasn't particularly good, except for keeping people physically in their homes. when there was a chance to challenge the courts and to give people more time to find ways to stay in their homes, the Democratic Party and the White House failed. And now we are going to be in a process where over the course of the next few weeks and months, lots of people are going to be in situations where they're either being forced out of their homes or they're being forced to dip into their savings in order to save their ability to have a roof over their head. And all this could be avoided if we just did the right thing at first, but we didn't. And it's very frustrating that that's the case. But I hope I have given you a decent understanding of what's going on. Again, the eviction moratorium at the federal level expired today. Hopefully some states will step up to the plate and realize that not only is this just the right thing to do, but it's also important from a public health perspective to just keep people in their homes. I can't say that I'm particularly hopeful about that, but I have to hope against hope, as it were, and just see who steps up and tries to keep people in their homes, because we have until Monday when the courts reopen, and then evictions and foreclosures will start to go through, and people will have their lives upended, and that's just not good. There's nothing about this this inherently positive. So best of luck, I guess, to all those people out there who are struggling and who may need help. If you can look to see if your hometown has a community legal services office or the rough equivalent, see if there are real estate attorneys who do pro bono work, anything that you can do to get help. For those people who know people who are in this situation, please help them find attorneys, help them find community legal services or the equivalent, help them with their rent if you can. I know a lot of people are struggling right now, but if you know people who are in this position, please help them, if not just to keep them in their home, for all of us as a community to make sure that we reduce the spread of COVID-19 and its variants, and we keep as many people in their homes as possible. Thank you.